So in this episode of the PETRONAS Retro Race Review, we're looking at the Hungarian Grand Prix from 2019. And James, what a race it was. We had wheel-to-wheel action with Lewis and Max right to the end. And then, of course, there was that wonderful strategy call from you guys on the pit wall. We've had lots of questions in, and I'm really looking forward to finding out how the race weekend was from your point of view.
Yeah, a difficult weekend, actually. Hungary was brilliant result and great racing. One of the races that you'll, again, for us, remember for a long, long time. It's one of the stars, the jewels from 2019. But a difficult weekend. Going into it, obviously, Friday was very affected by wet weather. And I think that was in part very much responsible for the show that occurred on Sunday. Less information, more variability. The other one is Hungary, Budapest as a track is a difficult track. It's not somewhere, actually, that on pole you normally can convert into a win. And certainly it's not somewhere that with a team with two fast cars, you can end up finishing first and second easily. Monaco, surprisingly, is easier to convert into a 1-2 than Budapest is. It's just a track that ends up creating a lot of racing opportunities in the race, accidents, and you can see the result there. Again, from the guy on pole, we ended up with a great race and ended up with Lewis taking the win.
Definitely was a great race. Traditionally, though, the Hungaroring has been one of the more challenging circuits for the team. But last year, going into the race weekend, Toto said that there were a number of reasons why you expected the car to be a little bit more competitive there than in previous seasons. And that brings me to my first question from Michael on Instagram. How did you turn one of your weaker tracks into one of your stronger ones?
It's a great question. This isn't something that happens overnight. It's something that's been building in the background for, I would actually say, multiple seasons, multiple years. So Shove and his team and Loic and the team back in the factory, and I would say maybe about 30 people, are really just focused on where our weaknesses are and what we have to do to fix them. And these aren't things that you fix overnight. There's no one item you can change in a racing car and suddenly you gain much better performance of the particular circuit. They're characteristics that you have to really ingrain into the DNA of the car over time. You have to first of all find out what the key elements are, how to modify them in an efficient way without losing perhaps some of the other great qualities of the car. And that's what those guys really did. And they carried on working through that all the way through 2019. By the time we really got to Hungary, I would say we had the best race car. Max was fast on one lap, and really, we had questions on Saturday night. I suspect in that camp on Saturday night, Red Bull were thinking, brilliant, we're here, we're on pole at Hungary, can't overtake, job done. We were thinking, we've got a strong race car, I wonder what we can do to convert it. And maybe we've gone too far. Maybe we should have really just focused on single lap pace because it's Hungary. You need to be somewhere near the front in order to win. We had in the race the strongest race car. I think that there's no doubt about that. But we also had the best rear degradation. We had the ability to keep the tyres alive for longer. Lewis was up behind Max for most of that race, pushing him very, very hard, and yet we're able to keep the rear tyres alive. Same with Valtteri. Unfortunately, contact early on the race meant that he was really fighting towards the midfield. But again, he kept the tyres alive because the car, and one of the elements that we've been working on incredibly hard, is the rear degradation and keeping the tyres alive. And I would say that race really brought it to the forefront.
So a lot of work goes into obviously preparing the car for different tracks. In terms of the work that goes into preparing yourselves for strategy, we've got a great question in here from Rishab saying, do you plan lots of strategies for a race? And what was the initial strategy that day in Hungary?
Let's go a little bit through the background of it. For a European race, 7 weeks prior, you need to choose what tyres you would like to have there. And that's why you see a lot of the teams turning up with slightly different allocations. The reality is we're not going to go crazy and just turn up with all soft tyres. You need to understand the tyres on a Friday. But the work that goes in about 7-8 weeks prior, you're doing around about 1 million simulations then. So not a small amount by any stretch of the imagination. You're just exploring different scenarios of what you expect to happen that week. Obviously, the more races you have, the more you understand the tyres in a given season, and the more you understand your competitiveness. It becomes actually easier across the season to choose your tyres. For reference, though, flyaway races are about 14 weeks prior, so they probably have enough time to prepare the tyres and ship them out. So in advance, many weeks before, we have a good idea of approximately what we're going to be looking at. Roll on 6 weeks later, so 1 week prior to the event. That's when the sort of heavy lifting of simulations kicks off. By now, we've normally had a number of more races, 8 more races or so worth of data to sort of put in there and understand 8 races. clearly not 4 races, apologies, of data to put in for somewhere like Hungary, 8 for a flyaway. And that goes into your models, and you understand a lot more about what perhaps has changed. Are we still the strongest race car? Do we have good rear degradation? Are the pit stops the best? And you reiterate through all the sequences to understand what you're sensitive to in Hungary and Budapest, and where the strategies sort of fall out. We have a plot here, which is the pre-race plot. And what you can see is this was sort of indicating that the 1 and the 2 stop were awfully close together, but it's Budapest. And the reality behind that 2-stop race is that you're going to have to fight through traffic to a certain extent. And even if you did, you barely catch the 1 stop on the last lap. And teams will rarely err towards a 2-stop in that given circumstance as a result of that. That's a very simplified view. Clearly, when you have multiple simulations, millions of simulations, you can't view them like this. You sort of look at this sort of conceptualized visualization of how those 2 million races have panned out. What on average ends up working for you? What doesn't? What are the circumstances you need to be looking for across the weekend? And as you go into Friday, what should you be doing on a Friday to understand the tyres in the best way possible to then answer some of these questions, the unknowns, before you get into Saturday and then Sunday?
Of course, you spoke about the changeable conditions we had in Hungary. How did that affect your planning then?
I mean, no one did any high fuel running in FP2 on the tyres. We barely got, I think, from memory, 3 push laps on the hard tyre, and then it rained. Everyone was on inters from then onwards. There was some data from FP1, but it's not enough. So going into the race on that hard tyre, the tyre that Verstappen was on, you need to be completing 40 plus laps on the tyre that you've done 3 push laps on. Now, our models cope to a certain extent. Clearly on Friday, we're not going to run 45 laps. We would have run 10 laps, perhaps. And we can extrapolate from those 10 laps what we think 45 laps will look like. The more laps you have, the better the extrapolation becomes. Bearing in mind, a track is a living entity in many regards. Just because the track was one way on a Friday in one temperature condition with rubber down doesn't mean it'll be anywhere near the same on Sunday. So you have to correct for all of these variables. And that's why you get unknowns going into the race. But in this circumstance, you're taking just literally this handful of data and trying to convert that into this prediction in many laps into the future. And that's where teams get it wrong fundamentally. It is incredibly difficult to do. And for want of a better word, you're sort of guessing. Now, we all qualified on the medium tyre because we had knowledge that the soft wouldn't be strong enough and the medium would allow for that 1 stop to take place. What was unknown was how far can you push that hard tyre? And that's what Friday did. That level of variability, which is normally containable within our models, was now just an unknown to everyone.
Well, that brings me on to Andrew's question. On Instagram, he's asked, how did you know the drop-off on the hard tyre would be so extreme? Tricky if you haven't had enough running, I guess.
The truth is, as I just mentioned, we didn't. But here's what we did as a plan going into the race. On the morning before the race, we had a brief with the drivers, and we just laid out what could potentially happen during the course of the next few hours. One of the ones that we put on the table was a 2 stops not completely out of the question. We don't know what that hard tyre would do, and here are the signs we're looking for in the race that it will happen. From Lewis's perspective, once you're back in second, the game plan for him was pretty clear. We laid it out to him in the morning, we reiterated it to him in the race. Pressure max, because you need to bring him in on the earliest point possible on that first medium stint to make that hard stint at the end as long as possible in order to put him in a situation where he could fall off the curve. Lewis did a great job with that, forced him in just to that region. Again, we have a little plot here to show you the Ferraris were there. And as soon as Verstappen clears those Ferraris, they do the correct thing. They react and bring Verstappen in to fit those hard tyres. We would have done the same thing at the front of the grid. If you don't do that, we would have gone for the undercut, taken the risk on the hard tyre and been in the lead of the race. And Lewis did that. The next part of the plan was go as long as you possibly can on that first stint of the race. Take it to the point where the medium starts to drop off. The reason why, we'll get more and more wear data on that medium. When it comes in, the tyres, and for the pit stop, the tyres come off the car and they're what we call wear checked. Effectively, they're cleaned up a little bit. They have holes across the surface of the tyres. You may have seen those on TV. We have a little gauge that just goes inside there and lets us know how much of the tyre has been used up. And that allows us to understand, to a certain extent, what it is relative to what we're expecting. How much wear was there relative to what we were really expecting at that point in the race? And it just helps your models feed a little bit more and understand what could happen in the forthcoming laps on the other compound. Again, it's a medium and you're trying to extrapolate in the hard, so there's a lot of unknowns, but everything helps. Lewis did take that tyre long, came back out, and you saw he was back up into Max's gearbox again on stint 2. And that's what we were asking him to do. Again, pressure him hard. Because either one or two things will happen. Either Max will run out of tyres because you're right in his gearbox and he's trying to defend against you. And we know we have better wear and degradation and you have a life advantage. Or we'll convert to a two-stop later on. And now he's on tyres that he's had to absolutely use to the maximum ability early on in that stint. And it gives you a best chance of making it work. So the plans that we laid out to Lewis, near enough all came to fruition. We actually completed near enough everything I said. The difference is we also had the similar plans for Valtteri. And unfortunately, Valtteri wasn't there. He was caught up in that instant and with a front wing damage, lost performance and back into that midfield melee.
We did hear Lewis and Bono on the radio talking about Lewis's brakes, and we saw some brake dust on the cameras as well. Dan has asked on Instagram, how concerned were you on the pit wall over the brake issues that Lewis was suffering from? Very.
I mean, we have systems that let us know where we can operate the brakes in a manner that we are confident the car will make it to the end of the race. These, like any limits, you breach over them, even a small amount, you are taking risks that that car won't finish anymore. And given the circumstance of finishing P2 or DNFing, and you have seen cars in Budapest previously with brake failure, it's a very serious and real concern. And you're clearly not going to throw away good points on the table for a championship as a result of fighting for a win. These metrics that we work to allow us to understand how we're performing on the brakes, and more importantly, give the driver a guide of what they should be doing in order to control it as best as possible. Because it's simple. They have tools at their disposition. One is getting the car into free air. The second is really lifting earlier, going to the corners, and getting the car to effectively use the brakes less than they normally would, using the natural aerodynamic forces to slow down the car. Lift and coasting is what it's normally called. And Lewis had to manage that while still trying to attack Verstappen. One thing to point out, the reason why Budapest is so difficult, brake issues aren't actually that common these days. We're able to deal with this at most circuits, but the straights are so short in Hungary, you just simply can't get the airflow, the mass flow through into the brakes that you need to cool them back down. And every time, especially when you're up against a gearbox and fighting someone, and you want to maximize everything, including under braking, you just get a step in temperature and you just can't bring it back down. So what Lewis was having to do, you would have seen him on stint 2 especially, attacking Verstappen for a few laps. Then we asked him to back off, and you would have seen him back off to about a second and a bit or so, just bring those temps back down again to allow us to continue going forward again. What we knew then is the temperature under control, but more importantly, the wear of the materials under control. So wear and temperature are directly related. And once we saw that we're back into aligned with the metrics that we knew would make it to the end of the race, we essentially put Lewis in a situation where he was able to race again. One point I should bring up is that two-stop actually benefited us. Clearly, if we stayed on the one-stop, you would have had Lewis up behind Verstappen all race. The two-stop meant that we were able to put the car also into its own little bit of free air, and there's a little bit of performance attached to that as well. Now, that's not the major consideration, but it did come in as one of the factors that we talked about when making that decision.
Okay then, so let's talk about that decision. Gav Vardy has asked on Facebook, whose call was it to box Lewis? I know there's lots of people in the team. Talk us through that decision.
You brought up exactly the key point. There is a lot of people in the team. There are several different types of strategic decision. There's ones that are very reactive, ones that take place in seconds. They're the ones normally that you can make a big mistake or a heroic call on. This wasn't this. This was a very clear, meditated discussion beforehand that we very much knew what we were looking for, which means you have time to discuss it as a group. The larger the group that you discuss it with, the more information you can bring to the table. So myself, Toto, James, Shav, and the strategy team that work with me alongside on all of these decisions, we're able to really talk through when we should be doing this, what are the signs we should be looking for, how we think the hard tires are going to be for many, many laps prior to making this call. But actually, the decision to go to a two-stop as a potential happened much earlier on. It happened at the point where we decided to pressure Max on that first stop. Again, as I said, that opens up either a possibility on the one-stop or the two-stop. And that was the point where we'd already highlighted we were going to go one of those two ways, and the two-stop was absolutely there as a possibility.
Well, then that kind of leads on to Benedict's question on Instagram. He's asked, how much planning went into Lewis's strategy, and did you think it would work? Did you have ways of knowing how successful it would be?
The successfulness rests on the hard tyre not making it. Again, we didn't truthfully know that it would or wouldn't make it 100% to the end, but we knew that it would be right on the limit. Even going into there with the models that we expected before the race started, we knew that that stint, a good 45 laps on a set of hard tyres, would be tough. We actually had two other bits that helped us to answer that question. The first, as I said, is on that first medium stint, we were able to push it longer and see how much the tyre we'd used up whilst behind another car. And we could see, actually, it's going to be a bit marginal for us. We could make it on a one stop from the lap that we stopped at, so Max could be in a more difficulty than we were. The second is that with Valtteri, we actually did exactly the same thing that we did with Lewis. It wasn't necessarily picked up, but we were one of the first cars that converted to that two-stop strategy in the midfield. Now, he gained relative to a car as a result of it. But the reason why it was less successful than Lewis is he had to drop behind three cars effectively after his outlap and overtake them on track. He did, and he did a great job with it. But it gave us, again, another step of information that allowed us to decide what to do with Lewis going forward in that race. So Valtteri was on that hard tyre, came off the car. We had a look at it. It was 2 laps prior to Lewis. We went, yeah, this wear is high. I think we have an opportunity here against Verstappen. And again, it doesn't give you 100% confidence, but if you have to do your balance of probabilities, which is fundamentally what strategy is, the balance of probabilities was that at this pace that Verstappen is doing right now, we have a good chance. More so, when you're on a two-stop, he can't sit there idling just looking after his tyres. He has to get a move on in order to keep the gap as big as he possibly can and use that. And the reality behind that is that will accelerate the wear. So nothing was 100% guaranteed, but we definitely knew that the best probability of winning was the two-stop, not staying out.
I think we all heard Lewis questioning Bono and therefore the team as a whole as to whether it was right to have brought him in. And then, funnily enough, we heard Max questioning his race engineer as to whether he should have been brought in. So there was this wonderful conversation going on. Of course, it is difficult to convince a driver when they're out there in the car to tell them, yes, we've got the data, it's going to work. Kadanoth on Instagram has asked, how tough is it to make Lewis or the driver believe in your strategy when they're out in the car?
Lewis can see about 800 metres in front of him and a couple hundred metres behind him in the mirrors. That's his view of the world. And the minute you can't see a car, and for reference, that's a couple of seconds. Once they're about 3-4 seconds up the road, you can't see them anymore. You're sat there in your own world, and you know what lap times you're doing, and you understand what lap times they're doing. So now imagine Lewis's situation. He was on the gearbox of Verstappen. He was fighting him. He wasn't getting through, but he thought in time, give him another 40 chances, maybe he will get through. He now is sat there doing lap times that are almost the same as Verstappen's the first few laps. And yeah, the tyres feel great, but he's got this mountain to climb to catch up, and he definitely can't see him anymore. And for him right there, that's when you felt that doubt. But what happened with him is he asked the right questions and we reassured him with the right answers. At the point where he could start to see that actually Verstappen was just trying to do his best to do lap times that really were out of his reach. And actually Lewis could do lap times that were over a second a lap faster without trying that hard. He understood that with the number of laps remaining, this was game on, and he had complete belief and trust in it. We have to, and our duty and responsibility is to try and create the environment for Lewis where he understands that we will create these situations. And when we do, it's based on information. And when we get it wrong, we'll talk to him about what we've done wrong, why we did it wrong, and what we're going to fix going forward in the future. And that, across all the years that I've had the privilege of working with him, has really built that trust up. I would say now the questions he asks are no different, I suspect, to many people at home asking the same question. He just needed confirmation that was more than perhaps the decision being made. And when it came to him, you would have seen he was on it. And like an arrow, he was straight up and onto the back of Verstappen as quick as he could.
Of course, this strategy call worked out. You've got the victory. But Denzel Clarkson has asked on Twitter, if you hadn't brought Lewis in for that two-stop strategy, would it still have been possible for Lewis to overtake Verstappen on the original one-stop? What did your data tell you?
It's unlikely. Let's put it that way. So there's two factors going into it. No one truthfully knows. I definitely can say that we had better race pace and a better race car than Verstappen. I think that the guys did a great job setting the car up, getting the car in the window. And as I said, many seasons worth of work went into making a car that was good in the race around Hungary. We knew we were on a strong platform. Conversely, Red Bull knew that they had a weaker package, both in terms of degradation and race pace. And whenever you have that, you have a strength that's in your court relative to someone else. So the reality behind it is now what you're relying on is that Verstappen's tyres drop off. Now, the reason why they dropped off is because he did push a lot harder when Lewis converted to that two-stop race. He was actually mostly in control of Lewis behind, and you would have seen we actually had to back Lewis off because of brake temperatures. That wouldn't have gone away. That wouldn't have got better during the course of the race. And whilst you truthfully don't really know what would happen going forward, I think the reality is Verstappen was managing it to a certain extent with Lewis behind him. You had to almost create a pressure situation that they couldn't control anymore. That's not to say, and I appreciate I haven't answered the question, would we have won on a one-stop? No one really knows. What I can definitely tell you is it was much better what we did in order to create an opportunity to win. The other point I should bring out is the strategy was great and it worked. We've also done another conversion stop at other places where you've caught up to the car and not got through. The reality behind it is this one was spectacular because the tension for us as well and the build-up that you could see happening over many, many laps. You knew that you were going to get these fireworks when the two came together. And on this particular occasion, as I say, that's why I remember it fondly.
I definitely felt nervous. I was there, and I'm sure people at home who were watching also were nail-biting right until the end of the race. Formula Chosen has asked, what were the emotions like on the pit wall and in the garage as Lewis was closing in? What did you all feel like?
So the exact emotion sequence of this, we're fairly calm individuals. We don't get carried away with things up until we know that we have delivered. I think that's the right way of putting it. So we didn't get excited at the point where we knew the lap times were coming in because you have so many concerns that you're harboring. Are the brakes going to be okay when you catch back up? Is the car reliability going to be okay? Is there anything we've missed at this point? What happens if another circumstance, a safety car happens? Well, now it's game over. It's not that you're pessimistic, but you are focused on the what ifs. And as a result of it, you don't let the joy and happiness of what may happen really wash over you. It's only at the point that the overtake happened that really I could say you get this wave that builds from the bottom up that just overwhelms you with emotion. It's like it's goosebumps is the way it comes out, which hopefully is the same feeling you will get as well. And when the overtake happens and we knew we were ahead, the brakes were okay, with very, very few laps left to go, and Verstappen really has to do another pit stop because his tyres are completely shot. That was the point that you had this expression of joy. And you see us do it in a number of different ways. When the camera's on the pit wall, you'll see us hit the pit wall, whoop in the air, make a lot of noise. Toto would probably smash the console. Not literally, the console's fine, I believe. But you have that wave of emotion that finally can be let loose. Then you harbour it, you bring it straight back in again because the car can still be unreliable. You can still have a safety car. You need to be on your toes. It's almost this momentary lapse of, I guess, your control to allow yourself to enjoy the moment. Then you get focused back in things.
Well, I'm sure you enjoyed the moment when you went up onto the podium. We all saw you, James. Gigi has asked, what made you drop the bottle on the podium?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is the privilege and honour to be able to represent not just Mercedes, both power units and chassis, but also really Daimler and our organisation up on the podium is a very much an overwhelming feeling at the time. You realise all of a sudden how big a puzzle you're part of, and it's just an incredible experience in life. Now, clearly, you're not going to ever think that this opportunity comes to you. So you don't go down to your local supermarket and buy a magnum of champagne and go, just get a little practice, just in case, you never know. Spray it around, see what happens. When you're up there, I knew Lewis was, his tactic is quite a straightforward tactic. He'll take you out pretty early on so you can't see a thing. And I don't know if you've had champagne in your eyes, but you really can't see a thing. And that's what he goes for. And he moves, I mentioned this in the previous video, but he moves before the end of the national anthem. I wasn't expecting it. And as everyone saw, dropped the champagne bottle because it was now covered in champagne, it was loose. But that did a beautiful second order thing that I didn't expect, but should have, which had then completely fizzed it up. So now I have this really active champagne bottle, but I can't see where I'm aiming it whatsoever at all. And that was my experience on the podium. Thankfully, though, it was good comic relief for everyone else, and I think I've done my part there to show how it's not done.
It was fabulous to watch the race and the podium, and I can't wait for more champagne moments very soon. Thank you so much for spending some time reviewing the Hungarian Grand Prix from 2019 with me.
Not a problem, thank you.